Hello, my friend-end friends, and welcome to my podcast, General Musings. My name is Kevin, and in this podcast, I talk about whatever's front of mind for me in any given week, usually in some way that's related to front-end development, and today I'm very excited to have none other than Josh Comeau joining me. Thanks so much,
Ooh.
Josh.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I love talking to other people that teach, whether it's front-end development or CSS specifically, and you're one of the few that actually does do a lot of content on CSS, so I'm really glad that you've come to join me, and I'm going to sort of pick your brain a little bit about that today.
Yeah, of course. That sounds great.
Yeah, before we get into the specifics of necessarily front-end development or CSS, I'm just actually curious how you got into teaching in general.
Yeah, so I think my earliest real experience with that was in like 2017, 2018, something like that. I got a part-time job teaching at a local coding boot camp. And it was one of those things where I was working out of a co-working space and there was a boot camp in the same, like at the local WeWork. So after my workday, I would go over and just hang out for a little bit because it's always so much fun, right? I went to a boot camp myself back in 2014. So I would like go to their demo days and just see what people had built, and that led to me getting a job there teaching part-time. And it was super fun. It's there's so many benefits to it. Like there's the energizing aspect of like being around people who are just getting started with it, and it reminds you of your own journey with it. But it's also super practical. Like people would ask questions that I thought I knew the answer to, like beginner basic stuff. And when you open your mouth to answer, you realize, oh, actually, I don't understand this as deeply as I thought I did. So it's a great way to like take a flashlight through your own brain and find the spots where you don't have as concrete an understanding as you do. But yeah, so I started doing that. I also started blogging in 2014 as well. So in a way, that's if we define teaching pretty loosely, that's been where I started initially. But yeah, those two things together.
Yeah, that your experience there of like the first time you go to explain something and then going, wait, I have no idea how to explain this. I can relate to that very much so. Yeah, it's really interesting. And as you said, like I find it's trying to explain things is like the absolute best way to find holes in your knowledge, just because exactly what you said, just sort of shining that flashlight. I like that analogy of figuring out things. And I think that works. It definitely works if you're trying to explain things out loud to someone else. But I think even writing a blog post or anything, I always tell people to do that just because like exactly that reason. You start trying to explain it and you go, wait a second, this doesn't click for me.
Yeah, actually, that was when I started the blog. A big reason was just to sort of keep a collection of things. Like you get stuck on a problem, you can't figure it out. You spend 2 hours, you eventually solve the problem, and then like 3 weeks later, you hit the exact same problem, but you don't remember the solution, and so you have to go through the whole friggin' process. And usually, it's faster the second time, but it's still like I had that experience enough that I'm like, okay, from now on, when I solve one of these tricky problems, I'm going to document what I did. That way, when I hit the same thing, I can go back. So that was really the main motivation. I mean, I also liked the idea of sort of getting my name out there and building a network that way. But that was really sort of, like my early blog posts, nobody read them. It was just for me and my own sort of building my own database of solutions to problems. And yeah, you're totally right that so many benefits to it. Like, yeah, just it has the same effect of trying to explain something to somebody because you're having to phrase it, right? Put it into paragraphs, and you run into the exact same thing of, oh, this thing that I thought I understood, if you can't explain it, you probably don't understand it as well as you think you do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, for me, the amount of like MDM rabbit holes I've gone down because of that. And then you actually start getting to like the real fundamentals of something and you're like, oh, everything makes so much more sense all of a sudden.
Yeah.
On your blog, speaking of that, you cover lots of different topics. I mean, it's front-end development, but you have just, CSS content, you have regular JavaScript, you have React content, talk about animations, and a whole bunch of stuff. And then, so I'm actually really curious why you decided your first course to be a CSS course instead of something else. Yeah.
Well, I did like what I thought of as like a pretty formal process where I had like a pro-con list because you're right, I had like 5 or 6 things that I could have covered. And ultimately what it came down to, like it did win out in the points system, but the thing that really made me excited about it was the thing I thought that, give me like 10 or 15 hours of somebody's time, I could have the biggest difference. Because I worked with so many React developers, JavaScript developers, who really were very comfortable with JavaScript and understood HTML pretty well, but like CSS was their Achilles heel. Is that how you pronounce that?
Yes, yeah.
It was the thing that they kept tripping over. And, CSS is a very difficult language to master, but 5, 10, 15 hours, you can get so much, you can cover so much in that ground that you can take somebody from being completely frustrated with it to having like a pretty reasonable understanding of it. So it just seemed like the highest return on investment I could offer, like the thing that I could deliver the most value in the least amount of time. And once I had realized that, I was like, oh, obviously this is what I should focus on at first.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and definitely agree that for people, that idea of the biggest return on investment, I definitely see that. That's a good way of thinking of that. I never thought of.
I do think that most developers spend so much time. Like when I taught at the boot camp, it would be like a 12-week program. 11 weeks were focused on JavaScript. The first week, the day one was just sort of foundations. Day two was HTML. Day three was CSS. So you have one day, or maybe 2 days in the entire process. So people don't really dedicate learning time to CSS. They pick it up as they go, and that's why so many developers have this sort of rickety collection of memorized snippets that they sort of deploy when they need to solve a specific problem. But of course, that causes the new problem of things don't always work the same way because there's all these mechanisms behind the scene that are connected in different ways that people just never learned, so they don't know. And so that was really, it was, an extra 10, 15 hours of JavaScript when they've already spent months learning JavaScript probably isn't going to move the needle that much, although I think that could also be fun too. But yeah, it was just, that was it, that it seemed like the biggest gap that I could address.
Yeah. I'm also curious, because you're targeting JavaScript developers specifically, a lot of my audience, I do get people that are coming from other backgrounds and stuff, but a lot of my audience is just beginners to web development in general. So I think the pain points can be a little bit different from people that already know JavaScript,
Right.
or a more traditional programming language. And I'm curious what some of the main frustrations that you see people having with it are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, like, for so many JavaScript developers, like I mentioned, they just hadn't dedicated that time to learning it. And so when you're a complete beginner, I think the benefit is that you haven't learned a bunch of bad patterns. You don't have any bad habits yet. The thing that I see that people struggle with is they have their memorized snippets, right? Like they know if they want to center something, they know position absolute, top 0, left 0, right 0, bottom 0, margin auto, right? And then that doesn't work if the element doesn't have a fixed width or height, or it doesn't work if the containing block is a different element. So I think when you have when you've been developing for 5 or 6 years, but you're still at a pretty rudimentary level with CSS, it can be hard to unlearn a lot of those patterns, or just finally go beyond using memorized snippets. Although I imagine it's probably pretty similar for everybody. Yeah, and I think that the reason I chose to make the course for JavaScript developers partially was that I knew so many people that were in that. I was kind of in that situation myself. I had started developing in 2007 and had a very similar approach where I never spent any time learning CSS. And it wasn't until 2016, something like that, that I decided that I was sick of this relationship of deploying my memorized snippets and then never being sure if CSS was going to do some wonky thing and derail my afternoon. So that was sort of my own origin to it, and that was why I thought I could. I've sort of forgotten the question. What was it?
Yeah, no, I think that's basically on what it was. It was about just the main pain points that
that's right.
people coming from JavaScript have, or why, I guess also just why they have the frustrations with it they do, because there's definitely people that get very frustrated with it. Yeah. And
yeah, I think that CSS, it's deceptive, right? With JavaScript, you're the one writing the logic. So every line that you write, and this isn't always true, but for the most part, you're the one deciding what should happen line by line. With CSS, you write 10 characters, display flex, and all this stuff happens. It's so declarative, right? There's all these mechanisms behind the scenes. The way that I like to describe this for JavaScript developers is that you're not writing the code, you're calling the functions. CSS gives you a bunch of these functions, and you're the one deciding what the inputs are, right? So if you say width 50%, maybe you're using Flexbox with display flex. So the algorithm is Flexbox, and that's already baked into the browser. You're not writing Flexbox, but you're giving it the inputs, and then it transforms those inputs into whatever layout you're trying to build. And because of that, if you don't understand that system, those algorithms and how they consolidate all these properties into a layout, it can be very frustrating because and especially everything is related to everything in CSS, right? If you don't understand stacking contexts, then the Z-index property is going to be much more difficult to use. The relationships between parents or ancestors and descendants, all these things sort of conspire to give you a language that's really nice to use when you understand it, because you can write a little bit of code that does so much. But if you don't understand all those things that are happening, it can lead to a very frustrating experience.
Yeah, I really like that way of thinking of it, of like, you're just, I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but you're just sort of putting in the inputs rather than writing everything, because it's a similar to the way I think about it, but never in that way. I think that's a nice way of approaching it. There's a really good talk by Miriam Susan that I always tell people to watch, which is called "Why is CSS Weird?" And it's about all like the variables that we don't control. Right, so it's like, you don't know the viewport size, you don't know the input device, you don't know the color range of their monitor, you don't, like, we know nothing basically, and it's just like, and you have to write code that's going to work no matter what, and that's kind of a scary thing too. But I think it's like you said, once you start understanding all of those, if you start understanding how you're, like, all those pieces you're talking about, whether it's the containing block or just the way Flexbox is working, when you do that, what's the side effects of that happening? Like, you start being able to work within those constraints that you have, instead of just trying to force things to do what you want them to do.
Yeah, and that's like what I think the real tragedy of this is that CSS has this reputation of being really sort of surprising and inconsistent, but it really is like remarkably consistent. It's just that consistency depends on a bunch of hidden variables. And once you understand it, it's such a joy to work with. So I think that's why CSS is so polarizing. Like, because most people, at least in the circles that I run in, really find it frustrating. But then there are also people who really enjoy writing it. And I feel like nobody's indifferent to CSS. Everybody loves it or hates it.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. That's one of my favorite things anybody ever tells me is, like, when people ask me why I keep doing this, and then I always have, like, there'll be a screenshot or something I can show them of, like, I used to, CSS was the low light of my day, and now it's like what I look forward to, and I'm like, awesome. Like, that is nice.
Awesome.
Yeah,
it's always nice to get feedback like that.
Yeah. I think you sort of already might have alluded to it a bit, but just, I guess, when teaching, you're talking about how within your course you have like the 15 hours you can really have the big impact. Is there any specific feedback you've gotten from people, or just having like worked with people and stuff, of like that one thing where you see all of a sudden things start clicking into place? Like they go from that place of just being frustrated with it to all of a sudden understanding some of those unknown things we're talking about, or how it works? Or do you just find it's a gradual process as they go through sort of material?
It's a good question, and it's like a little bit of both. Like, for the most part, it is sort of like the specific thing that people say, like, oh, this really helped me understand whatever the thing. Like, it's a bunch of it's different for everybody. It's like some people think that like my interactive Flexbox stuff is what finally made it click. But I think the big mental model shift that I try to encourage people to have is to see CSS not as a collection of properties, but as a collection of layout modes. So, like, rather than thinking, and this is how I used to treat CSS, like, you go through it property by property. Like, I'm going to understand how background color works, then how display works, then how flex grow works. But really, you should see it as like a bunch of mini languages embedded within CSS. So you have flow layout, which is the default, and then you have Flexbox and grid and multi-column. And all these sort of systems they have shared things, like background color works the same in all of them, but they each decide how to implement each property. So, like, the example that I use of this in the course is the width property, that you think width is a pretty static thing, like it's width 50%. But the way that works is different in flow layout and Flexbox, right? In flow layout, if you set width 2,000 pixels, you're going to get something that's 2,000 pixels wide. Like, it's pretty much guaranteed. Like, maybe there are some cases where that's not true. But even if that means it has to, like, blow outside of its container, that's what it's going to do, because that's what you told it. But Flexbox takes that same property and implements it differently. So in Flexbox, you're setting what you want the size to be, right? The hypothetical size. But then Flexbox uses that in its calculations. And if there isn't 2,000 pixels, it's going to shrink it down to fit, because Flexbox is all about flexibility. So that's the biggest thing that I think people bring up, is that it's not so much any specific understanding of CSS. It's changing how you see CSS and trying to think of it as this collection of languages.
That's awesome. That's good. I like that idea, and definitely, like you said, very true, that you'd think this one simple thing would just work. And I guess that's also what leads to some frustration is I used width there, why is it not working the same here, or whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And I think part of it, like, this is exacerbated by the nature of the web and the fact that you can never retire anything. So you can never say like, okay, we're going to get rid of this old way of doing it and we're going to only have the new way, because then you're going to break that website from 1997 that still has to work. So it does feel like we keep bolting on more stuff, and that leads to this sort of everything has exceptions and everything works slightly differently. It's for the very reasonable and good reason that you can't change anything. You can only add things. So you end up adding a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, and they do seem to be more mindful of that now. I think at one point there were certain things being done where they weren't as concerned about the consistency from how it used to work.
Right.
So yeah, I'm seeing it. There's a lot more thought anyway and conversation going on before they're like, okay, this is how we're going to implement it, which is good to see.
Totally.
You'd mentioned before your interactive example with your Flexbox, and I know, anyone who knows your blog probably knows it for all the interaction and everything that you build into your blog posts. And I'm curious about why, or just that, like, when you're making your blog posts like that, like, I guess you could just throw a code pen in to like show a quick example. That's what probably 99% of people do if they want to have a code snippet in there. So I'm just curious why you decided to like, I'm going to build out my own interactive playgrounds for everything that I'm mentioning in my posts.
Yeah, it's so when I started building my blog, this was sort of the core idea of the blog, is I wanted it to be as dynamic as any web application, where I didn't want it to be like a markdown doc, or I didn't want it to feel like a markdown document where you had a collection of elements and everything was, both because I like the idea of having more control than that, like I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, but also because I thought it would offer the best learning experience, that I think there's so much more value in being able to tinker with something, right? Like I think if a picture says 1,000 words, then I think like an interactive widget is like 1,000 pictures. Like it's the next level up from that. And yeah, I guess I could have made it a bunch of CodePen embeds, but it actually seemed harder to me to do it that way, because then like, like I have a library of components now. Like I have a demo component that has slider controls and radio controls. I have this whole set that I've built of little things that I can quickly assemble. And with CodePens, like each one of those would have been a separate project. And maybe there is a way in CodePen to like organize that, but I didn't know. And I just, I liked it. It seemed to me like it would be nicer if it was not in an iframe, if it was integrated right into the thing. Actually, with my course platform, I take this idea even a little bit further, because there really isn't a strict line between like content and code. So I have fun, like in one of my lessons, I have this paragraph that talks about how like, suppose you're at work and your coworker comes up to you and says like, "Hi, Kevin, can you help me with this?" And Kevin is whatever the student's name is. So it's dynamically, right, yeah. And people always message me about that. Like, hey, is this a coincidence or did you actually, especially like if the person's name is John, they're like, hey, is this a fun coincidence? If their name is Abdul, they're a little bit more clued into like, oh, this is probably me.
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. Mentioning there about like you bit of a perfectionist. I do know you put a lot of, just out of curiosity too, like when in the blog post you're creating, like how long would you say like a normal post is to put together?
Yeah, it really varies. And it has gotten faster as I've built up the library of components. My most popular blog post is the Flexbox one, I think. Let me see if that's still true, actually. Yeah, Interactive Guide to Flexbox is the most popular, and that one was probably like 100 hours. Like it was several weeks of it being my full-time thing. Because it was like, there's a lot of stuff built into that. I'd say the average is like 30-ish hours. So like the better part, really what I do is I work on it like 10, 15 hours a week, and it takes me 2 or 3 weeks. Mm-hmm. So something like that.
Awesome, yeah. The other thing on your site is there's a lot of like little extra touches, I guess, that you don't necessarily get everywhere. The one that I think of all the time for when I think of your site's the little heart thing. So it's already like, it's cute because like it looks cute as a little face on it, but then you click it and it's not just an instant heart. It sort of builds up the heart meter. So you're sort of encouraging people to spam the button and then you get the nice little animation. But I've also noticed that if you hover over it and then leave without clicking on it, it frowns for a couple seconds. And I'm just like, like, super cute. It's awesome. And I'm just like, most people, I'm guessing, don't notice that detail because like not many people are going to hover and then leave.
Right.
So I'm just like, I'm curious, like, do you create these things just for, because you feel like it and it's going to be fun? Or do you think that extra touch sort of does add that extra level to a website to make it something more memorable for people?
Yeah, I think both of those. I mean, it is like my philosophy when I started the blog is that I was working as full-time as a developer. And I really enjoy building things that are really polished and have that extra like, thinking through details. And like this, it's most obvious when it comes to like whimsical details, like sparkles and rainbows and all that. But it's true for like any sort of UX, right? Even if you're building a banking website that has 0 sparkles, you still want like the details to be thought out. And I was sick that in my day job, there would always be sacrifices, right? There's always like, we have this grand idea of what we want to do, but we only have 3 weeks. So like all of these nice details are getting they're not making it off the chopping block. And so with my blog, that was sort of my philosophy, is like, no, this is a place that if I want to spend 3 weeks on a detail that nobody will notice, I'm going to spend those 3 weeks. And the like button was a perfect example of that. It doesn't even make sense. Like my blog, like the reason like buttons exist are to inform an algorithm which author is worth promoting. I'm the only author on my blog. So it has no functional purpose. I guess it does, like, it sort of tells me whether a post is popular or not, but I have like I can tell how many people visit a blog, so that's probably a better proxy than people deciding to click the like button, especially because the like button doesn't exist on mobile because I couldn't fit it in nicely, so it's like totally not really good data. But yeah, I just thought it was fun. And I do think that like little details like that do make an experience more memorable, more fun. Like the negative version of this that we're all familiar with is the fact that like social networks will rely on anger and fear and like these negative emotions to drive engagement. But like positive emotions do that too. Nobody uses them, but if you can make something a little bit more enjoyable to use, that also creates like a stronger connection and is more memorable. So yeah, that's my whole philosophy, is to make things fun and to think through the details like that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do know you're working on a new course now about whimsical animations. Is it on? I've seen you talk about it, but just curious about the content for that you're planning on it. Is it more of how to create the animations, or is it also involved in like the UX side of things, of like the types of things that make good whimsical animations, let's say, instead of just adding confetti to every page?
Yeah, I want to have both. So like the bulk of the course is going to be focused, like all my courses are, on implementation. So it's, here's a thing, and actually the like button is going to be one of those examples. Not exactly the same, but similar. Mm-hmm. But I also do recognize that implementation alone, and you're exactly right that most people, when they want to add details, they go to NPM, they grab whatever confetti library they can find. And so you see I could picture it perfectly, right? It's circles, it's completely rainbow colors, they flip on themselves as they fall. We've all seen that like a million times. And the problem with that is that like the whole point of these things is to be surprising. Like it's not fun if it's the exact same every time. So I do think that the design part of this is critical too. So we are going to talk about tasteful ways to do this and how to make things stand out. Another thing that and this isn't so much a core part of the course as it is an idea that I want to spread more broadly. Certain things get really annoying if they happen every time. If you have this animation that takes 1.5 seconds, that's going to get really annoying for power users who have to sit through that 1.5 seconds 10 times a day. But the solution to that, in my mind, isn't to disable the animation or to not have the animation. It's to have it be time limited, right? So maybe the first 3 times you do it, you get the full experience. And then, you keep track of that in local storage with a little counter. And every time after that, you do the abridged version or you skip the animation altogether, right? There's so many tricks we can do so that you still have those moments of surprise and delight, but that it doesn't then become really stale as you see it over and over again.
Yeah, that's nice thinking on that. Because a little bit I think the two problems are not always people not knowing when to implement them. And usually it's overdoing it. Just there's too much going on. Everything has something, and then it takes away, I think, from the joy and just becomes distracting. But then, like you said, if you have something that is longer, that can be frustrating too. So yeah, that's cool. A cool idea on keeping track of that to make it fun and then not get in the way.
And it is. I mean, I struggle with this too, right? It is to find that line of what is too much. How can you not go overboard with it? But yeah, no, so I definitely want to cover that stuff in the course too, because I think that's, the person that I imagine taking this course is a developer who is building their own personal site or wants to learn some of these tricks that they can use in their own projects. And in those cases, you don't have an interaction designer on hand to do this for you. So yeah, it's definitely something I want to cover.
Awesome. just again, turning back to the blog in general, I'm curious, like when it comes, or even if it's maybe choosing the topic for the course, anything like that, I'm just curious how you decide what topics to cover. Because I know for me, I'm very good at getting distracted by the next, like, oh, that's a shiny new thing that I want to play with. So I'm just going to talk about that once I've learned a bit about it. Do you take a similar approach, or do you, is it I know you said at the beginning, it's when you had specific problems you'd run into, you would sort of almost document to yourself. That these days, is it similar or?
Yeah, not really. I do have a Notion doc that is like every time I have an idea for a blog post, I add it there. And what sort of winds up happening is I'll be like walking down the street or in the shower, and I'll realize like, oh, I think of a cool way to explain something, right? Like I think of a good visualization or even like a good paragraph. And so that gets added to this Notion doc. And once like an item in this doc has like 4 or 5 bullet points, like I can almost at that point, I can see sort of the structure of it. And that's when I take it, it sort of very organically creates like a pseudo outline. It's not like really an outline, but it's enough individual puzzle pieces that I can see how the whole thing will come together. So that's generally how it works, is like I might have an idea a year and a half ago, and over that year and a half, little things remind me about that. And once it reaches a certain point, it feels like, okay, this idea really wants to push itself out of its brain and become real. But there are also times, like you were saying, where there is like some new API that I'm playing with that's really fun, and it like I drop everything and go build that. So it's a little bit of both. It's also like I try to come up, like, I'm going to be starting on this animations course now, so most of my blogs over the next couple of years are probably going to be animation focused, and most of my blog posts over the past year were React focused because that was the course I was doing, which is both like, in my mind, part of the marketing strategy where I want the blog posts to get people excited about the course, but it's also like that's the world I'm currently steeped in. So that's where if I'm working on the React course and I come up with a cool concept for teaching React, I want that to be like shared more broadly. So I'll write a blog post about it too. So it's like lots of different ways, lots of different things like that.
Yeah. And then, so with the CSS course, you already said why you decided to start with that one. Then I guess React just felt like the natural next thing, because that's something that a big part of, I guess, what you do, and you have that audience of JavaScript developers. So.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, actually. I had initially planned for my second course to be an animations course, but I realized pretty quickly that a lot of the animations, not all of them, but maybe like a third of them really were a lot easier to work with React because of libraries like Framer Motion. Granted, I know like GSAP can also do a lot of really powerful things. It probably the issues that I'm not experienced enough with that. But I realized that like for my animations course, React would be a pretty useful prerequisite, and I should build the courses in the order that makes sense to take them. Because if I build a course that depends on React before my React course, nobody that takes that course would then go on to take the beginner React course. That was my strategy. It turns out as I'm actually building the animation course that React's a pretty small part of it. So I do think it'll be useful without React as well. But, that's sort of the strategy there was I knew I wanted to cover it eventually, and I should do all the like foundational pieces in that order. And yeah, it's, I started working with React professionally in 2015, and it has been like my framework of choice. So it did, I thought I had a lot of, and plus like when I worked at the bootcamp, I developed their React curriculum. So like I knew how to teach React to beginners because I had done it in person for several years. So it seemed like something I knew I could do well, that I would do eventually. So why not do it now?
Cool. When it comes to what we do, I'm curious because you're covering like with React, which has its changes that happen. CSS is always getting new features in it. JavaScript's evolving. I always get asked how I keep up with everything, and I have the advantage of being focused on a very specific thing, and I still have trouble a little bit keeping up with everything. I'm curious if you, or how you do it, and if you have advice for, well, we'll start with how you keep up with everything, and then we'll follow up after that with advice.
Yeah, I mean, the honest answer is I don't. Like, I'm definitely, like, I see, like, there's Adam Argyle on Blue Sky. It's like always like, hey, check out this new property that just landed in Chrome Canary, and it's super cool. But of course, it only works if you like download the experimental browser and go into the settings and enable the like checkbox. I generally like it was 6 months ago that I started exploring container queries, even though they've been in browsers for like 2-3 years now. So I'm not like an early adopter by any means. I sort of wait until things have a certain critical mass in terms of people are using them or browsers support them well. And as a result, like it does sort of, sometimes I think that like my job as an educator, I should be the person like sort of exploring the bleeding edge stuff so that I can then help make sure those ideas proliferate and the browser engineers who implement these things feel like their time was well spent. So sometimes I do think I should keep on top of things more than I do. But you're right. Like I do sort of have these 4 areas of focus, right? I have vanilla JavaScript, React, CSS, and animations. And like it's impossible to be like at the bleeding edge of all these things. I would do nothing else with my time other than like follow GitHub PRs, and it just seems like too much work. So I wait until things have sort of reached a certain point.
Yeah, I think as someone who does talk, I'm not like Adam. Like every time Adam posts something, I'm like, oh, I have more things to talk. Like it's insane the amount he's like of cool demos and stuff that he's always posting that of the stuff that's, as you said, going to be available to us in a while. But I will say, if ever you do decide to go more bleeding edge, all it's going to result in is a lot of people complaining about browser support. So
right.
You're probably taking the better approach from a content perspective there. And I made the mistake, like I did a video on Subgrid, I think probably 5 years ago at this point, because as soon as Firefox had implemented it, I made a video on it. And my thinking was all the browsers were so fast to put grid into place. Then Firefox did Subgrid. I'm like, it's coming everywhere. And then it was 4 years later, and I'm like, oh, they still haven't done this. Okay, eventually we got there, but I try and nowadays I either look at it as, can it be used as a progressive enhancement very easily, or I wait for at least 2 browsers to be like, we're on board with it, because then hopefully it won't be too long until the features somewhat available. You still have to wait a while if you want to put it in production. Obviously, it's a bit different, but
yeah. Well, it's interesting you said that about progressive enhancement, because this is a thing I've noticed. Is I'll share a feature on Twitter that, let's say, or Blue Sky these days, that has, let's say, like 91% browser support, but it's totally like text wrap is a perfect example, right? Text wrap balance and text wrap pretty, they're lovely features. If you use a browser that doesn't support them, the text looks exactly the same as it does without it. Like, it doesn't break anything, it doesn't change the layout. And so I would share these things, and people would say like, oh, I can't use it yet because it's not in browser. It's like, well, is there really any harm? Like, the worst case is that it's the same as if you didn't use it. But if you use it, then 91% of your users have this nicer experience. And so actually, I wrote a blog post a while ago that was specifically about, like, given an absolute number like 91% or 94% or 97% or 81%, like, how do you then get like information from that number? Like, can I use this property or not? And that was the first rule that I have, is like, consider the fallback experience. And if the fallback experience is fine, then it doesn't matter what the browser support is. If it's 5%, you may as well use it if the fallback experience is fine, because it's nicer for those 5%. So yeah, that you can probably tell that I've gotten that feedback quite a bit too.
Yeah.
To the point that, and that's another reason that sometimes blog posts come to be, is that I'm sort of sick of answering the same question over and over again. So I want to have a thing I can link people to that answers it in more detail.
Yeah. Yeah, it's frustrating when people push back on something that's progressive enhancement. I get really, I'm so tired of that now. And the example you gave is the best one, because the difference is so small one way or the other. It's like, it's better, but it really doesn't change anything.
Right.
And yeah, and I do get some people that are like, oh, it's because, at work we have to follow this or whatever it is. And I realize not everyone's in a position where you can like, or either they're not in the position to be able to like voice things, or they just don't feel like they're there, and maybe like people would listen to them more, but they don't voice themselves more. But I'm just like, I've never understood this thing where people want the website to look the same for every user and every browser. But then I'm like, one user can get 2 different experiences, because if they visit on their computer and they visit on their phone, that site does not look the same. So why can one user have 2 different experiences, but 2 different people that are never going to talk to each other need to have the exact same website? I just don't get it.
That's a really good, because I cover this in the course too. Like, I even have screenshots that show how Wikipedia looks on Chrome on Windows and on Safari on Mac OS, and they're like quite different. Like, even though it's the same CSS, there is like, and I even you can press a button and you flick between the two, and you see that like all the text moves and all the like aliasing is different. And yeah, like there's so many, your accessibility settings, your colors theme, your screen size, your display pixel, the number of hardware pixels, forgetting what it's called. I think it is DPR, right? Display pixel ratio. Like there's all these things that do change, and that, you shouldn't want it to be identical, because if you need it to be identical, it's like the lowest common denominator. Like you have to make it the worst version of what you're building.
Yes.
So like, it's good actually if you have different images, and if someone has a higher density monitor, they get the sharper image as a result. So yeah, I think I like what you said, is that like it is just, if the same person can have different experiences, if like that's an accepted reality of how we develop, then why would we expect different people to have the same experience?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really frustrating. Changing gears a little bit. I was quite a while ago, I think it was almost 2 years ago, you did a post on artificial intelligence called The End of Front-End Development,
Right.
which, appreciate the clickbaity title.
Yeah, that's high praise coming from a YouTuber. Like,
yeah,
I must be
exactly.
doing something right. Yeah.
The reason that you wrote it, you had a post at the top, just it was people sort of, should I get into front-end development now, or should I be focused on something else? And that was 2 years ago. And I think, if I remember correctly, the point of the article was to say, we're probably going to be fine. I'm curious if your opinion has changed at all, or if you're still sort of of the same mind.
I'm definitely, it's hard to say this without sounding very smug. But if anything, I think I was more right than I realized. Like it has, I feel even more strongly than I did then. Like in that post, there is a lot of hedging, because it's true. Like nobody knows how things are going to go. My assumption was that this would wind up being quite a bit like how spreadsheets were to accounting, right? When spreadsheets, like initially accounting, the whole job was tabulating numbers, because people would bring you a pile of receipts and you'd have to have like a physical spreadsheet, like a grid on a giant pad of paper. And like your job was to do the math. And then spreadsheets came around, and anybody could plug the numbers in and have the math be guaranteed correct and way faster and way better. But what wound up happening is that the job of an accountant went up a step. It went to the higher level of like, okay, you don't need an accountant to do this anymore, but you still need an accountant for this next set of problems that are beyond the scope of what a regular person can do. And in that blog post, I talk about how like this isn't a new idea for development. Like pre-AI, if I'm a dentist and I need a website for my dentistry practice or my bakery, you're not going to hire a front-end developer for $75,000 a year. You're going to go to Wix.com and you're going to grab a template that looks nice. So like already we had solved for the base case of building interfaces. What we haven't solved for is like, how do you build Facebook.com or, these giant, even like, that's like the one end of the extreme, but there's a whole range of things that human developers are still required to do. Mm-hmm. And the way that I see all of these large language models, and I've been using them quite a bit myself, I've been actually really impressed with how Cursor works, but it still feels to me like I am the one in the driver's seat, and this is a tool that's, doing sort of the same thing I would do, but quite a bit faster. I also, I saw a blog post recently, or a news article, about how Google CEO said that 20% of the code at Google is now AI generated. And the thing that headline leaves out is that 100% of that code was piloted by developers, right? No, I don't think of any company where like the workflow is that the product manager sits with the designer and like the product manager's at the keyboard, and with the help of the chatbot, they like build Uber.com. That doesn't seem to be what's happening. What seems to be happening is that developers have integrated this into their workflow, and they can be a lot faster, which is great. Like it's a pretty cool tool for that. But what I've learned in my own experience is that you sort of have to be a babysitter. Like you can tell the AI to do all these things and it will build them. But if you don't know what it's doing, you won't notice that it's being kind of curious here or there. It's doing something and I feel like those miscalculations would compound on themselves. Like it's great that I'm there and I can step in and be like, oh, actually, like this API is 6 years old and you should use this newer one that's better. And that will help in the next step of this, what we're going to do. And if you don't have that guidance, and I've heard people say this too, like non-developers that have been using AI, is that it's great for the first 80%, but then like that last mile is always the hardest part. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to say that I do think AI will continue to get better, and it'll reach a point where developers can be a lot more effective than they are even now. But I still struggle to see that last mile problem. Like, how do you get it so that it is so dependable that it doesn't need the knowledgeable person sort of guiding it around its whims and its curious decisions?
Yeah, I think I think it was around when your post was coming out and people were asking me. So about 2 years ago, I kept relating it to self-driving cars and being like, they figured it out sort of then, but it didn't take over like everyone said it was going to because of that. Even if you get it to 99%, that one last percent is the hardest point to overcome, because everything just gets like progressively harder to solve, all the like to get it over that last hurdle. And like right now, well, back then I think we'd, all the low-hanging fruit was sort of what was being taken care of. Now it's progressing, but definitely the rate of improvement is less. Like when I saw that post again, I was looking through it, I'm like, this sounds like you could have written it yesterday, basically. And it's still like, we're still sort of at that point. Things have definitely improved compared to what it was. And it still sort of amazes me a little bit that I think some of the tools are good, but like some of the implementations of AI are just so fundamentally flawed. And I'm like, nothing else would be pushed as a final product the way this is being pushed. It's kind of crazy.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's simultaneously amazing and nowhere near sufficient. Like both of those things can be true, right? It is very impressive. And like in my own work, I'd say that I'm like maybe 30 to 40% faster, especially like depending on what I'm doing. Sometimes I'm like 3 times as fast, right? If I'm just building out the boilerplate, it's like remarkable. You give it, the first 50 lines and it fills in the next 100 instantly and more or less the same way you would. But then there's other times where it really struggles to sort of do what you want it to do. And I do always try to like put myself in the shoes of someone who doesn't understand this stuff and like, what would I do with this information? Like, how would what would happen? Maybe I should do this as a test. Like, just don't look at the code at all and just trust it to do what it's doing. Because I suspect things would go off the rails pretty quickly.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I do think that it will get better and better. But I still don't really see, and this is the point of that blog post that I wrote, was I did hear from people who were saying like, hey, I'm a 3rd-year computer science student. I'm considering switching to something else because it seems like by the time I finish school in a year and a half, there's going to be no jobs, because that's what people were saying, right? But here we are 2 years later. And granted, the market is tough, and I don't want to take away from that. I know that it is difficult right now. I don't personally think it has much. I think it has a lot more to do with interest rates and like paradoxically the fears of AI. Like I think a lot of companies are slowing down their hiring because they too are under this impression that any day now, devinai.com or whatever it is going to be like, fire the whole team and just get 1 or 2 of these AI robots. But I think like as reality settles and as people realize that, oh, actually this is more of a tool than a replacement, these companies are doing very well financially. So I wouldn't surprise me at all if in the next couple of years we do see like a reemergence of a really good job market. That's what I'm hoping, at least, because I know it has been tough out there.
Yeah. I think it's also compounded with like the overhiring that went on for a little while too. So you had like,
right.
Everything coming together to make sort of a worst case scenario for the last little bit. But as you said, hopefully we start seeing a bit of a turnaround there. I've taken more of your time than I was planning to, so thank you for that. If you don't mind, I got 5 like really rapid fire questions. My new plan is to ask these to every guest I have, but you'll be the first one to go through them.
Okay.
Yeah, so just CSS related. First thing that sort of comes to mind for any of these. These are the types of questions I always get asked and don't have a good answer for. So I'm hoping that by asking a lot of other people, I can start stealing their answers, basically.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Okay, so the first one is the thing that annoys you the most with CSS. Or
goodness.
A change you could make to it or anything like that.
So it actually is coming. I saw Adam Argyle talk about this, but it's the inability to detect states. Things like whether an element is stuck or not, right? Like we have active and focus and hover, but any of the like, in a Flexbox container, like has the Flex wrap moved a thing onto a new line or not? Like there's so many like fluid design principles that are so great. Like not having any breakpoints and having it all be programmatic, but then you hit the case of like, well, actually, I need to know if this case has been hit or not to apply some CSS conditionally. And I think the scroll state that I saw Adam talk about that tells you it's like a media query, but it's based on whether a sticky element is currently stuck or not. So things like that, I think, is the biggest gap right now of like, I find myself wishing it could do this thing.
Yeah, I'm hoping the stuck, whatever they're calling it thing is going to be able to do, because that's on my Discord server, one of the most common questions is, can I know when a Flex item is wrapped or not? That comes up all the time.
Right.
Yeah. Speaking of new things, I guess, do you have a favorite new thing that you've been playing with in CSS?
Yeah, I mean, it's not super new, but the thing that I published a blog post about this today, container queries. I do think that they are like so much cooler than I realized they were, because in my mind, I thought it would be, solving the same problems as media queries, but with like a nicer syntax or with less indirection. But what I've realized is that actually, no, it's cool because you can have this thing respond dynamically to a media query or to some other, the number of items in a cell changes, which changes the size of the thing. It's actually like we were just talking about, like it's a way to respond to things that we previously didn't have a way to respond to. And it has, I find myself, now that I've like, I rebuilt my blog over the summer, and I told myself I was going to use a bunch of new CSS things. And the two that really stood out were container queries and the has pseudo class. Those two things are like, I don't know how I got by without them now that I've gotten used to them.
Yeah, has is definitely, well, both of them, I agree 100% with you. They're both awesome. So this could be one, either you use, so it's going to be your favorite CSS unit, and it's either because you just use it for everything, or it could be, I never use it except for this one little edge case, but I'm so happy that I have it. Anything like that would work.
I think DVH and SVH, so the viewport height units that don't have that problem on iOS where the size of the window changes because the browser Chrome changes. Those two are like, before that I would have to use percentage height because the VH unit didn't work on mobile, or it was awkward on mobile, so you'd have to use percentage heights, but then you have to chain that 100% down from the HTML tag down, and it led to so much confusion. And now it's like, I can just say like 100% or 100 SVH, and it does exactly what I want. And just, the CH unit too, I find underrated, where like, that's why I think I use it on my blog. I might have changed it actually. I either move to it or away from it. But rather than set the width to be like 800 pixels or 15 rem or whatever the equivalent is, or more than that, 50 rem maybe, you set it to be like 80 ch, and now the element will be roughly the width of 80 characters, I think, at the current font size based for that element, which is like, that's what I want, right? It's not, I don't care about the physical width. I want it to create lines that are a certain length. So that is nice. Mind you, actually, I think I did move away from it. And it was because I would have other elements, like I'd have an image that I wanted to be the same size. And that doesn't work, right? I guess you could make it percentage based, but it was, I ran into issues with that. So I thought it was neat, Yeah, I think depends on,
I use it a lot too for what you were describing, but I've definitely run into that where all of a sudden the imbalance that it can create, depending on how you're using it, can also be kind of, I have to come up with a different way of doing this. Yeah. Is there a CSS quote unquote best practice that you secretly or strongly disagree with?
That is a good question. And I see what you're saying about questions you get asked that you don't have a good answer for. Yeah, not really. Not really. I think that I can't think, the only thing that comes to mind is Tailwind has sort of become a best practice, or at least like in the JavaScript scene, it's become the de facto choice. It becomes like the thing that everyone assumes you're using. And actually my feelings have changed. I've gotten more fond of Tailwind, at least like not as a user, but as a person who exists in the ecosystem. I like that there's a tool that people are, like, it's nice to see people excited about CSS, even if they use a tool that I personally find very challenging and very frustrating to use. But yeah, that's even that. I don't have I'm pretty happy with I'm pretty happy with the established practices with CSS.
Cool. And actually this one you already answered, so we'll leave it at 4 questions because it's sort of a repeat. The last one was going to be if you could add one feature to CSS, but you sort of answered that with what annoys you the most. So yeah, with that, I just want to say thank you very much for joining me. Is there a best place for people to follow you? You have your blog. You mentioned Blue Sky. Is there anywhere else people should follow you?
I think those are the two. Yeah, so my blog is joshwcomeau.com, and I am at joshwcomeau.com on Blue Sky, which is like, I'm also on LinkedIn, but I'm much more active on Blue Sky. So that's, if you want to chat with me, that's where you'll find me.
Awesome. And if anybody is interested in your courses, where would they find those?
So joshwcomeau.com, there's a courses dropdown. I used to have a dedicated page for this, and I got rid of it because I wasn't happy with it. But yeah, joshwcomeau.com, click the courses dropdown. You'll find my 2 courses right now, one on CSS, one on React. And I also have a bundle that puts them together. And there are links to all 3 of those on the blog.
Awesome. So all that will be linked down in the show notes. And that's it for this week. So thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Josh, for hanging out with me. And until next time, don't forget to make your corner of the internet just a little bit more awesome.
This was great. Thanks so much.